find that I've added clips from Emily's own writings where she uses terms that I personally would not use because they are completely outdated and offensive. You have been warned.
Lovely dinner. Happy man. And I don't know Jimmy, Sally, or Susie from Canada.
Victoria, in the same year, British Columbia became Canada's 6th province.
Well, BC has produced plenty of great artists, but Emily Carr is arguably one of the most fascinating.
CTV's Mike McCardle has the last word on the complicated woman behind a phenomenal talent.
The leading art institute is named after her. Her paintings routinely sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. But there was a time when Emily Carr couldn't give away her paintings.
Hello and welcome. I am so happy and grateful you have stumbled or pressed on this video. My name is Aimée, but everyone calls me Aimée, and welcome to a space where we talk about artists and kind of try to learn from their mistakes while I paint their face. Fair use disclaimer, I do not own any clips that are not filmed while I'm painting. But it falls under fair use as this is an educational video, so you will learn a thing or two after this video or during this video. In today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the most misunderstood Canadian artists, Emily Carr. But before we get started, I must prepare my canvas. So today my source image is going to be this lovely image of me. I found it. She looks like she's giving a smirk, and I thought it would be really appropriate. So this will be my source image. But I am not a realist artist. As you can tell from behind me, I'm more into the abstract. So we're still going to keep it faithful to my style. This video is dedicated to my students and participants who, when they came here, we would talk about artist life so we can learn from their mistakes and hopefully inspire us in our own creative journey. So that's kind of the idea behind this series, just on the internet for a bunch of strangers. Emily Carr was born on December 13th, 1871 in Victoria, British Columbia. Growing up in the age of Victorian correctness, she was a rebel in her life and career. Her parents were named Richard Carr and Emily Saunders, and they were married in England in 1855, when the original Emily was only 14 years old, which was the norm in those days. Emily Sr. was born on July 3, 1836 in Freeland, Oxford, England, and died at 50 years old on September 22, 1886. Her father, Richard, was born on July 16, 1818 in Crayford in the United Kingdom. He died at 70 years old on November 20th, 1888. As a young man, Richard traveled to many countries until he heard of the gold rush in the Americas. Her father was an adventurer and was always seeking new challenges to gain fortunes. He stopped his travels and went back home, married a pretty English girl, and planned his trip to America. After their wedding in England, Emily Sr. and Richard traveled to the California gold fields in a sail ship seeing the promise of fortune, where they had Edith in 1856 and Clara in 1857. After making a small fortune, they decided to return home. Truth is, Richard was an Englishman, and being in America, he didn't fit in. He wasn't an American, and he would never be. He was a very proud Brit. They moved back to England where they lost 2 sons, William, who made it to the age of 4 days old in 1861, and John, who passed away at only 2 days old in 1862. While in England and dealing with the loss of their babies, Richard started hearing more and more about the New World and the wonders of the far west wilderness and promises. So, as you can guess, they took another sail ship and traveled to the west coast of America with their girls. The family ended up settling in Victoria, British Columbia. Richard loved it, even stating that the people were more English than the English. He felt right at home in this English colony. They would unfortunately lose another boy, this time Thomas, at 5 months old in 1865. This must not have been an easy time for the family, but things were starting to look up in other regards. The Carr family welcomed their next child in 1867 with the birth of Elizabeth, then Alice in 1869, who would be the last remaining Carr child at the end of the day, and then finally, the star of our story, Emily Jr., who made her entrance in this world in 1871 and would go on to be one of Canada's most celebrated artists. The Carrs would end up having one living son, who they named appropriately Richard. But unfortunately, little Richard, not the little Richard, but Richard Jr., would go on to be a very frail child and was only 11 when his mother died. For the time, her family was very well off. Papa Carr opened a flourishing warehouse business on 4th Street and they lived in a beautiful family home. Now, let's rewind to Emily's birth. Emily was born on a cold December day in a winter storm. The weather was so bad, it's reported her father had to trek in feet of snow to help the midwife make it inside safe to help with the birth. Little Emily would go on to be the apple of her father's eye growing up. Not a lady like her sisters, Emily preferred walking the property with her father and being outside with the animals. Emily was fiercely independent and a feminist before it was normalized. All she wanted to do besides play outside was draw, and her sisters did not take her very seriously, and did not take her art very seriously either, even later on in life. One of the first drawings she did was of a dog, a piece of paper she later found out her father kept until his death. Unfortunately, things got very, very dark when their mother, Emily Sr., passed away, destroying the family dynamic and creating long-lasting rifts between the sisters. Her once close relationship with her father was forever torn after an incident that happened after her mother's death, that she would later call the brutal telling. No one besides the people involved truly knows what happened, but here's a clip of a passage from her book explaining it a bit more.
I couldn't forgive Father. I just couldn't, for spoiling all the loveliness of life with that bestial brutalness of explanation, filling me with horror instead of gently explaining the glorious beauty of reproduction, the holiness and joy of it.
After she refused to talk to her father, he became more and more enraged with her. How this makes sense, I have no clue, but this would create a feud that would never truly heal. Her older sister Edith took on the role of a matriarch, which created even more uncomfortable dynamic for the young Emily, who already didn't fit in, which resulted in many petty disputes. Fun fact time! The home she grew up in is now a heritage site, and she is known to have depicted the Canadian spirit. And I am done my rough sketch, and boy, she is rough. I need to censor this, but at least it's a rough enough sketch to be able to paint. But that being said, I think I did a really rough sketch because I'm not quite inspired in the studio to really paint Emily Carr. I think it's way more appropriate if I go to the woods. So sit back, relax, grab a canvas or a snack, and we will be back after this commercial break in the woods.
Behold Emily Carr, painter, about to encounter the force that will consume her life.
How tightly they sealed their secrets from me, humble and pleading before the great trees, awaiting the invitation from the Spirit to come meet me halfway. Nothing is still now. Everything is alive. At last, I knew I must see through the eye of the totem itself, the mythic eye of the forest.
Seldom able to live by her brush, before she died in 1945, Emily Carr was in the first rank of Canadian painters.
This is much better. Before we go any further, I have come prepared and I have all my pens ready to go. I decided to do the face of Emily Carr blue today because for me, blue symbolizes communication and a voice. And for me, I feel like her voice kind of got reinterpreted throughout her career. So for me, it makes sense. Don't worry about it. Just know that the whole face is going to be blue. After the brutal telling, Emily would escape her family dynamic by going to art school in San Francisco. In art school, it was a good time for Emily, and it really allowed her to work on her craft, though it's said that during her studies, she didn't take it too seriously. And it's said her art wasn't particularly amazing at the time, but she did learn a lot from the experience. During her time in San Francisco, her little brother Richard would fall very ill and had to be treated for tuberculosis at a California treatment center. With that, the reality, and her sisters running the family business, Emily was summoned back home and told by her sisters that it was time to stop playing art. So, she returned back to Victoria to the family home. Although her sisters did not approve of her pursuing art, she did begin teaching art from the family home. And it's in the summer of 1888 her life would shift. She decided to go meet her sister Elizabeth, who was working as a missionary in an isolated village on the coast of Vancouver Island. Her family encouraged this trip, thinking it would inspire Emily to become a missionary like her sister. She became friends with the locals and learned their traditions, as opposed to showing them hers. The community was very charmed by the young woman, giving Emily the nickname of Kliwik, which translates to the Laughing One. She began documenting what she saw and experienced the only way she knew how, by painting and drawing, and would create tiny watercolor pieces and sketches.
Houses and people were alike at Ucluelet. Wind, rain, forest, and sea had done the same to both. They were soaked through and through with sunshine. I found a man with sympathy and a sincerity I'd longed for, but had rarely achieved among my own people.
Living the culture and relating to the people, and they did welcome her, well, according to her writings and the internet, so take that one with a very, very small grain of salt, as it is one-sided, and like they say, there's always three sides to every story. This experience would go on to change her life forever. On her trip back home, she met Mail Patten, the ship's purser, and boy did they hit it off, and would reportedly get caught holding hands under the tables and sneaking off together every chance they had. But it just wasn't meant to be. She had too many goals. She wanted to achieve many things and had many ambitions. And what we need to remember in those days, if married, your life was to produce children and listen to your husband. And that was not a life Emily wanted at all. She was set on becoming a professional artist, no matter what. This very personal decision she made was very taboo at the time, even within her own family. But at the end of the day, she chose art over marriage. That's not to say she didn't have suitors or was probably a secret romantic at heart, just hurt one too many times. In 1899, at the age of 28, Emily would go to England to study art. She did well, but felt out of place, homesick even. She missed her West Coast. Unfortunately, her trip lasted longer than expected, as she suffered a nervous breakdown and spent 18 months in a sanatorium. While there, she illustrated a journal she would later call Pause, a sketchbook. She ended up spending 5.5 years in London. She was drained and very hard on herself in those days. So close to giving up on so many occasions. Thankfully, though, she headed home, back to Victoria. But once returning and seeing the sceneries from her childhood, like the mountains and the trees, everything changed. She became even more rebellious when she got back home, truly perfecting the art of not giving a damn. From riding cross saddles, something not common in Victoria in those days for a woman, and just really doing her own thing. People, included her sisters, were shooketh. How dare she ride cross-saddle? But she didn't care. She became more and more herself. It's at this time she became a cartoonist to cover the bills. In 1906, at the age of 35, she moved from Victoria to Vancouver to teach art, and she was thriving. The students loved her and her eccentric ways. In the week, she would teach art, and on weekends, she would go to the beautiful Stanley Park to paint its ancient trees. These paintings would go on to be some of her most memorable work and lead to her first exhibition, where she ended up selling some of her art pieces. These were the happiest days of her life. She ended up taking a trip around this time to Alaska with her sister Alice. While coming back home from this trip, she would see, assuming for the first time, but honestly I don't think so, but according to my research, it was the first time, totem poles from First Nations villages on the coast. It's reported they were dilapidated and falling over, and that's when she got an idea, in her own words, to salvage the art. Aware of the impact of colonialism and communities being destroyed by settlers, she wanted to do something, anything to help. The art of the First Nations community around her deeply touched her on this trip, and seeing communities bulldozed. Okay, I don't think they had bulldozers at the time. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but you get what I'm saying. Well, seeing them destroyed broke her heart. Plus, the fact that no one in her settler community knew about this, as far as her circles went, she thought that she could help. By the time she arrived home, her mind was made up. She was going to document totem poles in their own village setting. And that's exactly what she did. She ended up going to villages and painting what she saw. Once done, she would pin her finished product in the village for the people to see what she had created, almost like a mini vernissage for the community she was in at the time. Knowing the importance of every detail, her goal was to show what she saw in her own way, not to interpret. Every detail mattered. The truth is, not everyone is or was happy about this and what Emily did, and has since, especially in recent years, created many conversations revolving around appropriation and her romanticization of the First Nations people and culture. The fact is, there are so many talented First Nations people who have been discredited, silenced, shamed, and that's just the tip of the iceberg ever since the settlers arrived. But then you have a white person who does it and people care? It's messed up. And it's part of our shared, well, I live in Canada, messed up story. I completely get every perspective. In other words, she wasn't living the struggle, she was simply watching it and making a profit. Well, in theory, actually, she did make a profit in her life, but the conversation is there, and the conversation is absolutely valid. It was very important when talking about Emily Carr. I do mention this. I'm still going to go on with the rest of her life, but please keep that in mind when studying art and when doing art, that it's our job, if you are an ally to the First Nations community, to give the people of the First Nations community a voice, not take the voice from them. That's just how to be an ally 101.
My watercolor sketchings of this period were accurate studies of the declining way of life for the Haida, Swimsha, and Kwakiutl villages of British Columbia.
She herself noting in her lifetime that the settler community in which she grew up in did not appreciate what she was doing, but the First Nations people in the area she painted in appreciated her documentation. But the truth is, like I said, there's 3 sides to every story. Around this time, she began hearing about different art styles and movements going on in Canada and the Group of 7, which would go on to change the course of her artistic journey. She was inspired by the post-impressionist movement. Wanting to further and push her craft, she traveled to France to study with the Anglophone Parisian art scene. There, she was reassured that her documentation of totem poles in villages was in fact important and very fascinating. This was the confirmation she needed. She returned home in 1912, inspired by her time in Paris. She would return home with new skills and views that changed how she painted. She stopped painting what she saw and began painting how she felt. through the use of colors and bold brushstrokes, creating movement in her work.
I spent many days that summer in the Queen Charlotte Islands, struggling to paint their poles. The Indian himself identified completely with this totem, but I could not do that. Nevertheless, I knew that my work had improved. In my older canvases, things were carefully and honestly correct. My newer ones went deeper. In trying to grasp the spirit underlying primitive art, I had totally deserted the traditional school for that of the post-impressionists.
By 1913, she had completed over 200 paintings and sketches, and would showcase them in Vancouver, hoping the government would purchase the series as a collection, but sadly, that did not happen.
Her idea was that the government should buy this collection, as a historical record, but this was a failure. It was felt that these brilliantly colored, strongly painted pictures favored the color too much to be truly accurate to what they were depicting, so that fell flat.
There was a depression going on. Many programs were cut. One of them was the purchase of her collection.
This failure would lead to Emily to stop painting and decide that she needed to make a living some other way. Rather than going back to teaching, she used her inheritance to build a house, which she made into a boarding house during the First World War, that she named the House of All Sorts.
I've had to become cook and charwoman for the lot of them, and I loathed every minute of it. No, I was not nailed. I was screwed to the House of All Sorts. Twist by twist demanded that I forget that I ever wanted to be an artist, and buckle down to being a landlady.
This would go on for 15 years. She stopped painting when the war started, but would resume later in the 1920s. But at this time, her work was more minimal and did not revolve around visiting First Nations villages. She found refuge in the house attic.
On the generous slope of the attic roof, I painted 2 Indian eagles. They were painted right on the underside of the roof shingles. Their great spread wings covered the entire ceiling of the attic.
Fun fact time! Boo! She would end up raising sheepdogs in the home's backyard. Actually, it was in those years she was seen always with multiple animals by her side at all times. Sounds like heaven if you ask me. Emily Carr was a known pet lover, and she had a pet monkey named Wu that would accompany her everywhere. As you'll notice from my painting, I'm trying to make it happen. So far it looks like a baseball cap. Emily Carr was always seen wearing a bandana with a hairnet, and when asked why, she would say it was to keep the hair out of her face. Smart. And an incredibly strong woman who was said to hide behind her eccentric behavior as a shield. Her art took the back burner until she entered the Canadian West Coast Art, Native, and Modern Showcase in December 1927, where she was invited at the last minute. She dominated the exhibition. Finally, her art was being showcased, and this would end up being the most important event in her career. And thanks to this opportunity, she met Group of 7 member Lauren Harris. Harris would become somewhat of a mentor to Emily. But wait a minute, what is Group of 7? So, Group of 7, for those who don't know, if you're in Canada and ever took an art class, I am guaranteed you have heard of the Group of 7. But for those who don't know, the Group of 7 was originally known as the Algonquin School, and it was a group of Canadian landscape painters that formed between 1920 and 1933. And basically, these people would meet up. I actually have no idea. I might do a video on them. I'm not sure how much they meet up, but they would kind of work together / apart. But their whole theme was to document the Canadian spirit through landscapes. And the original members included Franklin Carmichael, Lauren Harris, A. White Jackson, Frank Johnston, Arthur Lismer, J.E.H. MacDonald, and Frederick Farley, and would actually include other people as time would progress. Emily and Harris hit hit it off from their first encounter, and he would have a huge role in her life and post-death. She met the rest of the members of the group of 7 thanks to Harris. For the first time in her life, she did not feel out of place. She finally found a group/community of like-minded artists. She will go on to become an unofficial member of the group of 7, or at least grouped in those artists. The goal of the group of 7 was to create and promote Canadian art. She related greatly to all members of the group of 7's work, the Canadian landscape. Now that I got a base done and feel super inspired, I think it's time to head back to the studio. So stick around where I finish Emily's face after this commercial break.
Our home is unlike any other place on earth. And now it's time to return to all its natural beauty. It's time to explore BC.
And I am back in studio where it's nice and warm. She did return to the House of All Sorts after these meetings and would continue to push her creativity. At home, it said she hated clutter, so she would hang unused chairs from the ceiling and pulley them down when guests would need one. It's safe to say she was now entering the second phase of her totem pole journey and village paintings, but now more landscape-based. In her mid-50s, she decided to take a mega trip. Sketchbook and paint in hand, she headed north. She was set to do what the group of 7 was doing in their respective areas, but she wanted to document the West Coast, documenting the spirit of nature.
Time was running out, both for myself and for the Indians. Oh, how I've wasted the years. Beloved West, don't crush me, but keep me high and strong for the struggle.
It's at this time that her style would shift once again. But now towards the Cubist movement, really just defining her style. She would take many trips to the woods in these later years to camp and would eventually get herself a little cabin, almost like a caravan, called the Elephant, and not exactly the same, but kind of reminiscing of the cabin I was just at earlier. But she wasn't completely alone. She had all her animal friends with her. Story goes, each animal had their own place to sleep with their own little beds in the tiny caravan.
And then she took us into the caravan to show us where her various animals slept. Each one had its own box above. She said, this is Woo's room, and this is the bird, and this is the cat, and this is the dog, and so on. And they all knew their own place. I don't remember ever seeing a mixture of animals that treated each other in a way that very polite people treat each other.
Her most iconic work was made in these days, creating movement in her masterpieces. Unfortunately, her health would start to decline while staying at the Elephant. Fun fact time! Emily was known to write how she was feeling while she was painting her paintings and would write the words behind her canvas. An example was if she was feeling sad, she would write the word sad behind her canvas. If she was feeling happy, she would write happy behind her canvas. Other fun fact, apparently she wasn't the nicest person and could be very jealous. I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the research I did, there's a lot of undertones of just people talking about her like she was a really mean and reserved person. But yeah, the rumor is she was not the best new artist. She was known to be pretty hard on anyone who wanted to learn from her. And I actually have an example of this, so check out this clip.
In the 1930s, she met a young Jack Shadbolt, later a prominent British Columbia artist. She wasn't friendly, saying more work and less talk will make him a better artist.
In the 1930s, she was encouraged to write even more. She was always journaling before painting, but now she would really let her pen do the talking, and her work would be featured on CBC Radio.
Tonight, we present Clewick, the writings of Emily Carr.
Painting update! Woo! So right now we got a pretty good base. I decided to give her a wink from my rough sketch. I really like where this is going, so now I'm just really putting the final touches together. Today we are using my favorite brand of paint. We are using Saks True Flow Heavy Body in blue, white, and black. And stay tuned, and I'll be right back after this commercial break.
Hey, I'm not a lumberjack or a fur trader, and I don't live in an igloo or eat blubber or own a dog sled, and I don't know Jimmy, Sally, or Susie from Canada, although I'm certain they're really, really nice. I have a prime minister, not a president. I speak English and French, not American, and I pronounce it about, not a boot. I can proudly sew my country's flag on my backpack. I believe in peacekeeping, not policing. Diversity, not assimilation. And that the beaver is a truly proud and noble animal. The toque is a hat. The Chesterfield is a coach. And it is pronounced Zed, not Z. Canada is the second largest landmass, the first nation in hockey, and the best part of North America. My name is Joe, and I am Canadian. Thank you.
This would lead to her words being heard across the nation. She even received the Governor General's Award for her first book in 1941. Emily Carr was anti-residential school, a fact many people gloss over due to the misinterpretation of her book in the media. She did not believe that children should be separated from their families, and she openly criticized missionary attitudes throughout her life, which is super ironic, and honestly it makes sense because she traveled with her sister who was a missionary, saw it wasn't for her and all the bad it did. But unfortunately, when it came to her books, her editors actually cut out those parts in her books in fear of the backlash of the time, and she was not impressed. She would go on to describe her life as a struggle in her books, never truly fitting in. Sadly, she would go on to have several heart attacks over the years, and due to failing health, she was in a wheelchair at the end of her life. Emily Carr passed away on March 2nd, 1945. She was pretty secluded during her later years, and her death came and passed without making any waves. Harris would end up being an executor to her will. A little scandal about that. No one knows why, but Harris ended up separating her lifelong collection of work in 3 categories. Number 1, to go to the people of Canada, so like museums and things like that. 2, to be sold for scholarship. And the last category, and the most taboo, was paintings that were to be destroyed. So no one really knows how he decided to separate or why, but he did end up destroying a lot of her work that did not fall under the umbrella of the Canadian landscape. We're talking about the work from her Paris days, the work from her time in London, the work of when she gave up art and then restarted just doing art when she was a landlady, all gone. I don't even know how I feel about that. What do you think? Please let me know in the comment section below. How does that make you feel, knowing that there's so much art that someone in her later life just decided to destroy?
Happened to it? Why did Lorne Harris select what he selected? Why did he destroy what he destroyed?
Last fun fact time. Emily was not formally part of the group of 7, contrary to popular belief. And the last fun fact of today, as much as Emily Carr is now known post-death as a visual artist, during her life she was far more known as a writer. My thoughts before researching this video? Well, she captured the Canadian spirit and was liberal when it came to her color use. She was a badass woman living in a cabin in the woods, wasn't actually part of the group of 7, and there's a university and a bunch of elementary schools named after her. After my research, though, that all still stands, but she was very misunderstood and seemed like a good time in my eyes. The reports on her death are definitely written by men and come off very triggering to me. But I had so much fun researching this video. I learned so much. I had so many things confirmed of why I love her and resonate with her, and I hope you learned a thing or two. And with that, I want to thank you so much for being here, for taking the time and learning about the amazing life of Emily Carr. And also, be easy on yourself, and I can't wait to see you for my next video. Bye!
You guys are still here. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that video, and remember to like and subscribe.